In this video, we are going to look at how I can use CSS and classes to manipulate the behavior of elements. In this example, you can see that I have a UL and I have a bunch of LIs. And if I do nothing, there's a certain default behavior to this stuff. So just to make it a little bit more polished, I've made some changes to the UL, put a border around it, gave it a border radius, took the bullet points away, and then just gave it a bit of a padding. And here we can see that here's my UL with my LI item. So I don't actually have a lot of code that goes on here. But what I want to be able to do is change the display type of this thing. So I want it to be the way that it is now, but just add a little bit of decoration to the list item, but only if it behaves like a list. And if I change it to a grid, I want to completely change what that looks like. I could go here now and say, okay, well, for each LI, go and add a bottom border for me. So I can say border dash bottom is solid silver 1 pixel. But there's a problem. Like when I display this as a grid, it is still going to do that. So I don't want to do this. I want to be very specific about my LI styling depending on whether or not this thing behaves like a grid or not. That being said, I could also just override it for the grid and assume that my default state is a list. So much of this is going to kind of depend on what your intent is. For now, I'm kind of going to leave it this way, because when I do swap it to a grid, I'm going to actually override the styling for me. The result of my styling thus far gives me this result here. And this is the minimum amount of work that I had to do to get this going. Now there's some further alterations that we can make, like I don't like the fact that the last item has this line under, it doesn't look right. So you can add the styling to remove that. I'm not going to go through that detail right now. I think we'll probably make a separate video on subjects like that. But let's go and focus about how do I change this thing into a grid and how can I override what this default styling is. I've added a style called grid. So if I add the class grid to my UL, it is going to change this to display grid, and I'm going to have 3 columns of 5 rem. And then for anything that contains the class grid that has an LI in it, I want the border just to be around it. So on the normal LI, I have the border at the bottom, but I'm going to override that LI so that now instead we have a border around. So let's see what this looks like in runtime. On the UI, by default, I have the normal layout, nothing special here. And then I'm just going to edit the HTML here and add a class. I'm going to say that my class that I'm going to add is equal to grid. And now, just because I added the class grid, all of a sudden my list changed. And it now has this display grid on it and the template columns. And then if I take that away again, boop, back to a list. So it's very easy to change the behavior of an element and its sub-elements by adding or removing classes to this UL. So there's really no limit as to how I can manipulate this thing. It really comes down to what classes do I append. Now currently we're just adding one class to it, but let's look at how I can change it by chaining multiple classes to the UL. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another class called red, and if the UL is red, then I want the ally to have a color of red. And in this case we're going to say, okay, well, let's give this a class of grid and a class of red. And let's go and play with this in the DOM and see how this can affect what we see. Going to the page and refreshing it, I can now see that I have a grid and red items in it because that's the classes that I've added to it. Let me go and take the red out. Oh, now the items aren't red anymore. And if I put the red back in, then I can see that the items are red. What if I take the grid out? Well, the expected behavior would be that I see my normal list items, but now it is red. And so by cleverly designing the classes that I have, I can start adding all kinds of effects to it by just adding or removing classes, and I can reuse that whether I'm displaying it as a grid or a list, or change it to be only unique to when I have a grid or only unique to when I have a list. But I hope that in this video you start getting a sense of the power of CSS classes, that I can use multiple CSS classes to build up the effect that I have, so that I can actually reuse them in tandem depending on what kind of effect I want to go for.